Dear friends, Saul's weaknesses are beginning to show. He is neither ashamed to claim Jonathan's victories as his, nor afraid to disobey God by taking the role of a priest. As Saul makes one foolish decision after another, did God remain still? Today's lesson has the answer. Hello, brothers and sisters. It is so good to have you again as we look at another episode of Through the Bible. Our previous study introduces Saul, the first king of Israel at Mizpah. While there were some secretly opposing Saul, his defeat of the Ammonites under Nahash after the threats he gave to Jabez strengthened Saul's general hold on the Israelites. His kingship was reaffirmed again in Gilgal as Samuel gradually made way for him. We also saw Samuel coupled together warning and encouragement to finally tell Israel that their request for a king was in total rejection of God. He stated to them that God graciously granted their wish, but would not hesitate to destroy both Israel and their king if they failed to obey his law. So as he encouraged them to remain faithful to God and promised them of his continual prayers for their welfare, he reminded them that it was Yahweh who has chosen them to be his people. Leaving our review at that, we shall continue to look at the reign of Saul together.
1 Samuel chapter 13 verses 1 to 4. I hope you have your Bibles with you. Please turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 13 verses 1 to 4. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become a stench to the Philistines, and the people are summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. The true character of Saul is beginning to emerge. Who got credit for the victory? It was Saul. Jonathan appears to be the capable military leader. Later on, we will find that he gains another great victory by using very interesting strategy. But in this particular battle, Jonathan did the fighting. And who blows the whistle? It's Saul. Saul blows the trumpet. Saul took the credit for winning. Saul blew his own horn. The army knew Saul's report was not true, and so did the followers of Jonathan. Verses 5 and 6. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. When the men of Israel saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Apparently, the Philistines recovered from their losses and came with force against the Israelites. As you can see, the situation is critical. Moreover, the Israelites had no weapons. Then you begin to see what's happening here. Not only are the valiant soldiers of Saul in hiding, they are also deserting him. This is desperate. This is a critical situation. Verses 7 to 9. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. Verse 8, he waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal. and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Here is another revelation concerning Saul. He presumed that because of his position as king, he could offer a burnt offering. Later on, we will find that another king by the name of Uzziah also presumed he could perform a priestly duty. God judged him severely. He became a leper. Saul ignored God's explicit instructions that only a priest from the tribe of Levi could offer a burnt offering. Verses 10 to 11. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived and Saul went out to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. Saul replied, "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought," he presumed, "I thought," this is verse 12, "now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." He thought, he felt compelled, and he offered the burnt offering that he was not supposed to. But before we begin to condemn Saul, let's get into Saul's shoes for a moment. Here he is under tremendous pressure. The soldiers were hiding, some of them scattered themselves, they even left the territory of Israel. Then, on the other hand, you have the huge number of Philistines coming up against them. Samuel was a little late in arriving. And on the other hand, if you will notice, in a few verses down below, the Israelites were actually totally unarmed. They didn't have any weapons, while the Philistines had chariots and plenty of them. It would have been extremely traumatic for Saul to keep things together. Fear, doubt would have driven him to the point of making him take the step of disobedience. It's easy to say that Saul was presuming or rationalizing, or that he was blaming everything and everyone else. But tell me, what would you and I have done at a critical time such as this? What have you done in the past? Saul forced himself to offer an offering and make supplication unto the Lord. Verse 13. "You acted foolishly," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and appointed him leader of his people. You have not kept the Lord's command." Saul was told in the beginning that if he obeyed God, he would be blessed. But if he disobeyed, there would be judgment. When we sin, it's not because we merely made a choice based on all the available options. A number of times when we fall, we are forced to a point of making the wrong choice. Think of the time when you fell. It was not simply because a choice was available. Many times you were forced to the point of making that decision. It appeared the only visible path, and then you ended up making a wrong move. See, this is what happened to Saul. Saul has disobeyed, so God has another man to be king. He is going to bring him on the scene a little later. Even Samuel at this point does not know who he is. Verses 15 to 17. "Then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah in Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. Think of this. From 3,000 in the first verse, now they are reduced to 600. It's quite a desperate situation. Verse 16. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with him were staying in Gibeah in Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah in the vicinity of Shaul. The battle is about to begin. Verse 19. See how desperate the situation is. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plowshares and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes, and for repointing goads. The Philistines had totally disarmed the Israelites. The Israelites were permitted, however, some farm implements, but in order to sharpen them, they had to go down to the Philistines. In this way, the enemy was able to keep an accurate account of what the Israelites had in the way of weapons. On the other hand, the Israelites had probably only sticks and stones. So verse 22 and 23, so on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Now a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash. Only 2 men, Saul and Jonathan, had swords. I suppose the other men in the army carried all the other farm implements. This was the way Saul's army was equipped to fight. Chapter 14 now. Chapter 14 gives us the strategy of battle that Jonathan used against the Philistines. Apparently, Jonathan's strategy was to take his men through a narrow pass. Here, with a few weapons they had to fight with, Jonathan's army had a distinct advantage. We will pass over the details of this battle and look instead at the great spiritual lesson that is here. Verse 18, Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God. At that time it was with the Israelites. Saul should not have taken the ark to the battlefield. As we have seen before in the days of Samuel, the children of Israel used the ark in a superstitious manner, thinking it would help them win their battles. Apparently, Saul has the same reason. Verse 23, so the Lord rescued Israel that day, and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven. In spite of Saul's action in bringing out the ark, Jonathan's faith and strategy won the battle on the human side. God is with this young man. It is too bad that he did not live long, and God saved Israel that day. Verses 24 to 27 of chapter 14. Now the men of Israel were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, Cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth, because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath, so he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. It is interesting to note that Jonathan did not know his father's strange order that no man was to eat until the battle was won. Actually, Jonathan had already won the battle. Now we begin to see the real or the true nature of Saul. Verse 28, Then one of the soldiers told him, Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, Cursed be any man who eats food today. That is why the men are faint. Jonathan said, My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? It was indeed a foolish command that Saul had given. The men were tired. They had fought a battle and won. They needed definitely something to eat for nourishment and for strength. And Saul had said, I will not let anyone eat anything until I am avenged of my enemies. His modesty was absolutely gone. Verse 35. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. He actually built an altar to the Lord and offered sacrifices. Verses 36. Saul said, Let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive. Do whatever seems best to you, they replied. But the priest said, Let us inquire of God here. So Saul asked God, Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand? But God did not answer him that day. Saul therefore said, Come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if it lies with my son Jonathan, he must die. But not one of the men said a word. Saul, you see, is not willing to take the blame himself. He says that someone else has sinned, and the army stood silent. They knew the victory was Jonathan's, and now Saul was saying, The reason God did not answer me was because someone did not obey me and broke the oath. The army knew that Jonathan had tasted the honey, and they knew that Saul was putting up a tremendous front at this time. They stood in silence because he was the king. Verse 40. Saul then said to all the Israelites, You stand over there, and I and Jonathan my son will stand over here. Do what seems best to you, the men replied. The army is not saying much. They are probably just tolerating Saul's leadership. Verse 41. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, Give me the right answer. And Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul believed Jonathan was guilty. Saul said, Cast the lot between me and Jonathan my son. And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, Tell me what you have done. So Jonathan told him, I merely tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now must I die? Jonathan was guilty of doing what Saul had not wanted him to do. Saul had said, Cursed be the man that eats any of this food this day. But was this something to die for? Saul said, May God deal with me. This is verse 44. Be it ever so severely if you do not die, Jonathan. But the men said to Saul, Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Saul would actually destroy his own son if he stood in his way. Why? Because as you can see, Saul is beginning to show jealousy. He wants all the glory for himself. The army had remained silent through all of Saul's rantings and ravings, but when Jonathan's life was at stake, they no longer kept quiet. We are now beginning to see the character of Saul. Later on, we will see how he will act in direct disobedience to God. He is going to do something that will bring tragedy to the nation of Israel. Had not God intervened, it would have meant the extermination of the nation. Saul is revealing his true character. We will see in the next chapter that Saul is not obeying God any longer. He is following his own devices. Finally, the Spirit of God will no longer speak to him. God will no longer give him leading. And he will turn from God to the demonic world. Then we will study the remarkable incident when Saul actually consults the witch of Endor. It is a section with a great lesson for us in these days in which we are seeing the manifestation of demonism, the occult, the worship of Satan, and astrology. Dear friend, starting anything may be simple. Starting is easy. But what happens when the pressure gets high? The funds are low, debts are high. Will we still hold on to our convictions? Will we still hold on to God? Or will we choose to take steps that are contrary to God's word?
Dear friends, we have all seen deep character flows in Saul since the time his name came up in our study. Other than the false humility, there are also attributes of falsely pious, impatient, and presumptuous. A very deep thought on the core of why he did what he did led me to conclude that he did not trust God with all his heart. His notion of himself sent him into hiding during his installment at Mizpah. He then took the credit for Jonathan's victories, followed by his inability to trust in God's timing. He was only looking at himself all this time, and God was to be his magic wand. It was out of this attitude that he superstitiously demanded for the ark to be brought in the battlefield. Every situation, even God, was exploited to fit his plan. And we know too well, dear friends, that God was not going to be dictated by man. Nonetheless, this mentality and approach saturate many minds, including Christian leaders, right in our generation. So who is God to you at the moment? Do you trust Him enough to wait still and obey? With these questions, I wish you many blessed days ahead.